Hey ladies and gentlemen, welcome to PHP Tips. So I've got 10 tips for you, and make sure you stick to the end of the video for the bonus tip as well. So these tips will help you improve your PHP coding, and also remember that there are many ways to do the same things in PHP. So the more tips you get, the better you get with your code. All right. So what I've done is I've made sure that my Apache is running my server. So just switch on your server if you want to type along. And then I've created a folder inside my htdocs folder. So that's inside C XAMPP htdocs, and I've created a folder called tips. That's where I've put my index.php file, which is this one right here, so we can do some tests. So tip number 1, Booleans. So let me copy some code here. Now, usually I've seen people type true like this. Now, so I'm just here to tell you that it's better to type this in small case letters like that. It runs a little bit faster. Okay, and so here we can have true. This can be written in small letter, capital letter like this. This is all good. So if we test our code right now, you see that it shows us that is true, okay? And of course, we can write false in a similar manner, like so, and it will show us that it's false. Very good. Now, it's better to use small case letters like that. It runs a little bit faster. No difference. But an even better way is to use 0 and 1. So if I put 1 instead of true, then you will see that it still writes true. And if I put 0, it will write false in there. So you can use 0, 1 instead of true and false. Now let's put an empty string and see what that will write. Okay, it still writes false, but if I put any text in there, it becomes true. This is how PHP runs. All right, now if you've noticed, when I put my if statement, I didn't say if bool is equal to true like this or is equal to false like that, because this is actually not very good practice. What you should do if you're checking for true, just check if the item, just like this, without saying is equal to true or is equal to false. And if you want to check for false, simply put an exclamation point at the beginning here. If not Boolean, that means you're checking if it's false instead of true. So those are some shortcuts you can use when dealing with Booleans. All right, so very simple tip. Now let's move on to if statements. Speaking of if statements here, let's see how we can restructure an if statement like this one. So let me copy some code from here in a moment. So this is very simple code. For example, if user is male, then you put this text inside the gender here, and then let's do echo gender like that. So this is very simple and straightforward. Let's add a base value to this one. So we say if the user is male, then we will see that. If female, we'll see that, right? Simple and straightforward. Let's check that out. So user is male, which is true. And then if I change that to false, for example. So this could be user input. As the user is entering their details, you want to know whether they selected male or female. So user is female. So the way we can restructure this code is to remove the else statement entirely. We don't need this. So I can grab this and put it here instead. So if I move gender is female like that and put it there, right? And then eliminate that entirely. So the else statement is not necessary. This will still work as intended because first of all, we assign we say user is female, right? But then we check if user is male, then we change that to male. Simple and straightforward. So in this case, if user, it will still show us user is female. See, nothing really has changed. If I put true there now, you will see that it comes back to male. So same thing, but without the else statement. And then the advantage of doing this, because we don't really have an else here, we can also remove the brackets entirely, like so. Make it even shorter. This way, it will still work as intended. As you see, user is male. All right, so let's move to a second example of if-else statements here. So let's look at this function right here. So I'm going to grab this function. Let's put it back here where we have that. Okay. So here we have a function that gets gender in the same way. User is male. Let me just put a default value here, just so we don't need to supply a value. Now, what you can do in the same way we restructured that, we didn't need the else statement, but within a function, there's this return key. So return exits the function and returns whatever value you supply. So in the same way, instead of moving this else part to the top, we can just simply remove the else statement altogether, like so, and move this like that. So what happens here is that we say if user is male, and we will see it will return user is male. And then once it returns here, it means it will never get to this bottom part here. So there's no need for the else statement at all. And then we can do this as well. Shorten the code even more. So say if user is male, then return user is male. Otherwise, if this is not true, it will return this one because there are only two possible results here. So that's one way to shorten functions like this. Okay, so let's go to a final example on if-else statements, right? So let me grab this and let me put that function over here like so. All right, so let's take a look at this function a little bit. So in this function, we are doing a get post. We want to grab a post. So we imagine we are grabbing a post based on the post ID. So the first thing we check to see if the post ID actually exists. And then if it does, then we run a query. So these are just make-believe functions here, just to illustrate the point. So if this was a real function that queries a post based on post ID, it will put the post content in here. And then after that, now since the post exists, the post ID exists, that exists, so we put another if statement here and put more code here. Now this is a small block of code, but you could put quite a bit of code on here to a point where it would go to another page. Like for example, it would be like this. All this here would be code, 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 and then finally at the end there's this else return no post found. This is very common practice as I have seen. Now this is okay, but it could be better because it gets a bit confusing, especially if the else statements are very far at the bottom here. You may, especially when correcting your code, you may find problems trying to keep up with which else statement is where. So instead, what you do is you start with the block that has the lowest amount of code. In this case, this else part has this return no post found. So instead, what we do is we cut that out. Let's remove the else statement entirely. So once we remove that, we go up here and then convert this if statement. So I'm removing this entire block completely. So I remove even that closing bracket and then come to the top here and then close it here instead. And then do that, say return no post was found, but then let's put a not here. We negate this so that now immediately it checks if there's no post ID, it just says no post was found and it ignores the rest of the code. Now what this does is that if the code reaches down here, it means there is a post ID, so it will get to this part. And now we can move this part with a tab, because you see it had to go inward because it was inside an if statement. Now it's no longer inside an if statement, so we can move it out like this by Shift Tab. So we move it so it's just indented once. So this part here, no post found, but if it continues, then the post ID is there. And then you can continue with this block of code like this, and then return your post at the end like that. So this helps, especially if you have a lot of nested if statements, because the nesting can get out of hand where you have several if statements within if statements like that. Instead, what you can do is just check for those small blocks first. Make sure that if you negate them like this and then return immediately, that way you can relieve yourself from being inside if statements all the way down like this. So hopefully that helped out. And then finally, you can just use a ternary operator if you can. So if you have a simple if-else statement, use a ternary operator and its shorthand where necessary. So let's see like this one right here, where we have this whole code block here. Let me put that back. So let's make sure that we have a value for this guy. So what you do instead of all this whole part here can be replaced by a single line. So that single line is a ternary operator. So instead what we do, let me mute this whole part here. We do not need it anymore. So what you can do instead is you say echo. Now the ternary operator is like this. You have a condition like that. You have a condition, and then if the condition is true, whatever code you put here will execute, and then you put a full colon, and then here this code will execute if the condition is false. So there's a condition here. If it's true, whatever is here will run. If it's false, whatever is here will run instead. It's as simple as that. So in this case, what is our condition? Our condition is user is male. We're checking whether this is true. This part here should evaluate to true or false, of course. So user is male, right? Question mark. And then if user is male, what code do we want to run? We want this code to run right here. So I'm going to paste that there. If user is not male, we want this other code to run. So we'll put that code here instead. Now in the end, we want to actually echo the result of this. You could put this inside gender, where you could say something like gender is equal to, like this. And then depending on the condition here, gender will have either this value or that value. Or since we are going to echo it anyway, we can simply just say echo right here directly, like so. So all this code here is reduced to this one line down there. Okay, so let's give it a test and see how it works. So if I refresh, you see it still says user is male because that's true. If we put that false, you will see that it will say user is female. So this is one way to reduce this code. Now you could actually nest this ternary operator where there's a question mark, and then if something is true, then you can do another condition within this, right? Another condition like this, and then put another question mark, full colon, and semicolon there like so. So you could still do nesting within this, but I wouldn't advise you doing that because it can give you undesirable results because of how PHP works. It starts from the left and goes to the right. So don't nest ternary operators like this. Just do them when it's a single if-else statement like this one. All right, so hopefully you've learned something there. Let's go to our next tip. For our next tip, we have the no coalescing operator. So this is one of my favorites here. So I'm going to copy that code and paste there. So imagine you have this kind of code where you have A is equal to no, like this, and then you want to assign B based on what's happening to A. So let's say here this is no, and you say if A, in this case this is going to be false because A doesn't have anything. So you say if A, so it will go to the else statement, which means B will be equal to this default value. So if we echo B at this point, like so, we're going to see that B will contain this because A is equal to nothing. So let's check that out real quickly. And if I refresh, you say it says default value. Now, if there is a value within A, let's say some value like that, then B is going to be equal to A and not the default value. So let's see that simple example. You see it says some value. Now, instead of all this code, you can replace this with a single line. So what we're going to do is this. Let me mute this part here because we don't need it anymore. So here I can say B, like that. I can say B is equal to, and then I'm going to say A, like that, and then put the no coalescing operator that looks like 2 question marks like that, and then tell it to assign a default value like this. So this whole line here, this whole content here is replaced by this single line here. Okay, and then if I now echo B, actually let me remove that here because we need that original value like that. Okay, so let me go back here. So you see that it works the same, some value there. What this double question mark does is that it checks, it's as good as asking if A is set. So it replaces the is set function in this case. So you say if A is set, then set it to set B to whatever value is inside A. But if A is not set, then give it this default value over here. Okay, now if A could be set, but if it's equal to no like this, it's as good as it's not set actually. So even then it will give you a default value. So let me go back here and refresh. You see that you get the default value. So this is very cool. I could echo this directly here and do that. So you can use this inside echo statements like this. Okay, you see that? Now, unlike if, for example, we didn't have A at the top here, let's imagine the differences here for a moment, right? If I do this, so if I just come and say if A, and then I do, excuse me, I do all of that. Let me put a B over here. Let's see what the problem is with this code as it is. You see that it shows me a warning and says undefined variable A, right, on line 6. So it gives me a warning that I'm trying to check an if statement for a variable that does not exist. So unless I put a default value here and then check the if statement. But we don't have this problem when we use the no coalescing issue. So as you can see here, let me do this. You see that I don't get that error anymore. Even though I never declared A like this, it still checks if A is set and still gives me the default value if it isn't, but if it is, it will echo A. So this is a better way of doing things than having to check with the if statement. Instead, just use this double question mark like this. And then if I had some value within it, like so, you're gonna see that it will get that value instead. So this is a very good way of checking things. Now, this is not even the best part of this. The best part is that you can use this with arrays. So I have an example here. Let me grab this part here. I can't scroll very well, so bear with me here. So I just want this part up to there, like so. So I can grab this as well and use it later. So what I'm gonna do is paste this. All right, so I have an array here called A, and the array has another array within it. So there's A, there's a key value pair in there, and then key 3 has a nested array within it, like so. Now, instead of having to check if is set with this, and then we set a value like that, we can actually check using the double question mark if any of these are set before we try to use them. So let me remove this. Let me just say echo, let's say A. So here I want to check if key 2 actually exists and echo it. So instead I'm just going to do this and then say key 2 like that, and then put a question mark here, double question mark, and put default value or any other value that you would want instead. So this is very valid. It will check instantly instead of using is set, right? So let me grab this here and refresh. Oh, sorry, here on line 6 there's a problem. We need arrows. I forgot those arrows there, sorry. So that's an array like that. Okay, so if I now refresh, you see it shows me value 2 because it does exist. If I put a key that does not exist, it shows me that default value instead. Now the best part is that I can actually use this to find even nested keys, like this one for example. Okay, if I grab this, if I say key 3, and then within key 3 I can do this, I can still check a nested value like this if it exists or not. So I'm gonna grab this again. Let's do that. You see it shows me nested value 1 like that. But if I put a key in there that does not exist, it shows me the default value. So this is a very good way to do things like this, to set default values, especially inside arrays, to even check if a key exists, and then if it doesn't, you perform a different action over here. Now the best part here as well is you can even run functions within this, right? So let's see this here. Or even throw errors in here. Let me show you what we can do here. If this does not work, we can say trigger an error like this and say the item was not found. You can even do things like this. So which means if this doesn't returns null, we can actually run a function within there, not just assign a value, but just run a function. So although I'm doing an echo here, what I should be doing is that saying something like value is equal to, and then if the value does not exist, we trigger an error over here. So if I come back and refresh, okay, item was not found in on line 14. Where is that? Let's see here. Oh yeah, so it shows me the error. The item was not found on line 14. Or you can say throw new error like that. Let's see how that runs instead. And there we go. It shows, it throws a fatal error there, and then an item was not found in, and then there it is. So that's how you can do things here. You can do that, or you can just run functions. So let's see how we can do that. If I had a function like this and say my func, like so, okay, this one just returns return my func, just the name of the function, right? Let's imagine that. And then we have a second function over here, my func2, and it just returns my func2. So here, instead, the returned value, you can echo it and say echo, and then you try my func like that. Okay, that's a function. Then put those question marks like that, and then run my func2 instead, like so. So you can even use functions like this with this operator. So what this is doing is that it's asking the question, what value does my func return? In this case, this one. If the result is a null or an empty, then it's going to run this one instead. So let's see how that would work. So if I refresh, you see it says my func, because my func does return something. Now imagine here we return false. Let's see how that reacts. If I refresh, it doesn't actually show anything because it returns false. False, by the way, is also a value. So remember that this is like replacing with Isset. So even though you have a false there, it's still a value. So it will only trigger if I say no, like that. No is the real empty value. So when I do that, it's as good as it's not set. Then you see my func2 working there. So what I want you to get away from this is that make a habit of using this double question mark when you're not sure if a value exists, right? So whenever you're using a value, let's say for example you have an array and you want to make sure that a key exists and you want to use it. You don't know whether the key exists or not, but you want to use it. So what you can do is you can put a key and say maybe key A, and then do this, right? And then instead, if it doesn't exist, you put a 0 instead. So this is very valid code right here. So let me show you this. If I do echo like that, let's create that array real quick. I'm gonna say array is equal to, let me just put some values here, first name and then last name, like that. Okay, and then I will need a here. So let's say for example a is equal to an empty, like that. Okay, so which means a is nothing. So normally if I do this, I'm gonna get an error. Let me show you that. If I try to access array null, which does not exist here, I'll get an error. So let's watch that. I'm gonna refresh. You see warning undefined array key on line 7. But if I put that question mark and say 0, it will default to a 0 instead and not show me an error. So refresh, you see it shows me first name there. So this is good practice to make sure your code is error free. Our next tip is the limitation of the isset function. So let me put an example here real quick. So let's say I have a variable here, my var, and it's equal to null. So I have set this variable, but it's equal to null. Now null is the default value in PHP for a variable that has no assigned value. So if I ask is set my var, let's see what it's going to tell me. Is this variable set? Let's go to our page over here and refresh. And it says my var is not set. Excuse me. Even though this is not true because my var is set, it's just set to null. So sometimes you may want to know really if a variable is actually set or not, whether it's equal to, it has a null value or it has something else. So in that case, what you need to do, there's another function which is get defined vars, like so. So what I'm going to do here, I just want to print out what is contained in get defined vars. So I'm going to echo some pre-tags here just to make the printing look cleaner. So let's go to our page and see what we get. So if I refresh here, it says my var is not set. And then these are the defined variables in the entire PHP system here. And you can see there's a get, there's post, there's cookies there, there's files, and then looky there's my var. So my var is actually set, even though it says my var is not set. So what you can do instead is to check, instead of using is set, if you really want to know whether a value is set, whether it has null inside it, what you could do is you could say get defined vars. If is set, so copy this, let me remove that. Oops. So here, instead of checking if my var is set, you can check if is set get defined vars, like that, and then my var, like that. Okay, so if that is set, let's look at what results we get. Excuse me. So maybe to make the read better, we can do this and say vars is equal to, let's see why that isn't working. So vars contains my var in there. So if is set vars my var, let's see here. Okay, still it just says is not set. So what you can do instead is say if key exists, right? So let's use key exists. Array key exists actually. So the key is my var, and then the array itself is get defined vars. So let me copy that and put it in there like so. So I can remove this now, and this as well. Let me make sure that there is a bracket for each bracket here. So if array key exists my var inside get defined vars, then the variable is set. So let's go back here and refresh. So my var is set, even though it's set to a null. So the point here is just remember that is set sometimes will return false if the variable you're trying to check contains null inside it, then it's not set. Our next tip is to learn to pass by reference. So I'm gonna copy some code here and paste it over here. Alright, so we all know that a function is self-contained in that a variable that you declare in here is not available outside, and a variable that's declared outside is not available inside the function, unless you specify that this is a global variable. So in this case, if I define a as 1, and then I run this function and pass in a into that function, right? So this function here, we need to actually call this function. So I'm going to say my func over here, and then pass in a like that. So there is this function, and then I call the function and pass in my value a, which is equal to 1. But within a, I'm setting a is equal to 10 like this. And then when I echo a, you'd expect that a would be equal to 10, but it isn't, because this is a different variable altogether since it's inside the function. It does not represent the global version of a. So in this case, we're going to see a will still be equal to 1. So let's try and echo this out, and you will see it says 1 like that. But this is a very simple example. Sometimes you're dealing with large objects, maybe images. Let's say you are cropping an image. So here you create an image resource, and then you run a function that resizes the image before cropping it, right? So you're going to pass in that image reference into the function, and then need to do some manipulation. Now it has created 2 copies of the same image, because there's this one that's in the global scope, but whenever you pass it into the function, it creates a second version that is isolated from the outside, because whatever you do within that function does not really change the resource that's outside, like you have seen here. So in that case, you have 2 image resources that are taking up so much memory. So instead, what you do is you pass your value by reference, and you do that going to the function here. Before the variable, you put an and % like this. So once you put this and symbol here, this becomes a pass by reference instead of copying. So what this means is that when I do this, the A that I'm dealing with here is the same A that is on the outside, because both are pointing on the same memory location. So if I edit this in here, I have edited the one outside as well. So this is good practice to save memory if you're dealing with large objects or resource files like images and stuff, or you are encoding video or whatever big large objects. Maybe it's a database object and this contains a lot of rows in there. You can pass that item by reference instead of what's the opposite of passing by reference? Maybe it makes a clone or something. So let's check this out. Once I've put that pass by reference, if I now refresh, you see that A is equal to 10, because any manipulation in here actually affects the object outside. So this is good practice to save memory if you're dealing with large objects. Our next tip is a recursive function here. So let me show you what I mean. So instead of repeating code, you should use recursiveness. So let's try a simple example here of recursiveness. So here what's happening is that there is there's a variable here called A, which for the moment I have set it to a string like John, right? And then there's a function here that all it does is say hi to whatever name you've passed in here. So what happens is that you pass in the variable, which in this case contains a string, and then it asks the question, is this a string? Is A a string? So if is string A, that's cool. Just echo this here. Okay, so you echo hi with a string. And then it asks if, in fact here you can put an else statement to reduce problems, so that once it runs one of these, it doesn't have to run or question the other. So that's entirely up to you how you want to code that. So let's see what will happen when we run this code. So if I refresh, it's supposed to say echo hi John. I haven't run the function. This is why it's not doing anything. So I have to actually call the function here and say hi like that, and pass in the value A like so. Okay, so now that I've actually called the function, it should run. So let's go back and refresh. As you can see, it says hi John. Very simple and straightforward. Now if I pass in an array instead of names, so there's John and then there's Peter, like that. So now we have two names over there. So instead of running through here, it's going to use a loop instead and loop through the names and then echo each name there, like so. So you see here, oh, on line 4, I've made a mistake somewhere. Oh, I didn't save it, that's why. So make sure you save before you try to test it. So you see here it says hi John, hi Peter. Very simple and straightforward, right? Now the problem here is, as you can see, we are repeating code. You see this echo hi here. This is exactly the same thing here. So there's a problem here. As soon as we are repeating, sometimes you can't do anything about it, but in this case we actually can. We can use recursiveness. Now this might not look like such a big deal, but imagine we had to do a lot of things here. Once we grab that this is a string, we have to say hi John, and then we do a bunch of other stuff down here, like this for example. I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do that. And let's say there's a lot of text here that we are supposed to, let me grab a, I'm looking for a page lorem ipsum, so I can grab some text from there. So let me see how that will run. I'm just going to drag and drop this into my browser here. So open a new. Okay, so I just want a large bunch of text. So I'm going to grab this over here just to illustrate a point here. And if I paste that like so, maybe there's a lot of code. Now we can imagine this not as a single line of text, but a lot of code here, like so. Oops, This is quite a bit. Yeah. So as you can see, as you can imagine, if I'm doing this here, I'll need to redo exactly the same thing here as well, like so. You see? So that it doesn't look like there was a difference. Whether we had an array or a string, once we loop, here we do it once, but then here, down here, we are looping through each name. So let's see how this would fare in here. If I refresh, this is what I get. So you see, there's hi John, and then some more stuff that's happening here, and then another guy, hi Peter, and then more stuff happening down here. So to the untrained eye, the person who doesn't know, they can't tell whether we passed in an array or a string. It just looks the same. And then the worst part is, if I try to edit, let's say for example, there was some information I was displaying on this one after the username here, and I want to change that. I would need to change it here and then go back and change here as well, because these two parts need to be identical, right? So you get the point here, where if there's a lot of text or there's a lot happening in that one if statement, then this becomes a real problem. Like this, it's not a big deal because there's just one line that we are echoing here. So how exactly do we solve the problem? How do we not repeat ourselves? Now in PHP, the way PHP works is that you can actually call a function within the same function. So for example, this function is say hi, right? I can actually call the same function within here, like so. Okay, now instead of passing in a, which is an array, I will pass in name instead here, because I want to pass in that name. Oops. So I am within this function say hi, and I'm calling it back. So let's think logically what's happening here. Now you have to be careful when you're doing a recursiveness, because you can create an infinite loop at times. So let's see here. There's a function that we call here. And then let's imagine a is a string, right? And not an array like this. So what will happen is that it will check, is it a string? And then it will just echo that. And then it won't bother with the rest of the code, because even if it did, a is a string and not an array. So nothing will happen. Just echo and done. But now imagine it's an array, right? So a comes in as an array. This is skipped, but then it comes to here. Is it an array? Yes. So as it is an array, loop through the array. Now each time through the loop, there's a string being created of each name. Let's say the first time it's John, right? And then we run this very function again. While it's looping here, right? We run it again with a name. And then imagine it's a separate function that's running while this is looping. It runs, and then it will find that name is a string. And so it will just echo this and forget about it and exit. And then we loop again, the second name, and it will echo that there. So in actual sense, only this part of the code is running, really. So whatever edits we make here, they work for both strings and arrays. So let's check this out. If I run this like so and refresh, you'll see that it runs exactly as intended. And then if a, for some reason, was just Mary, for example, just a string instead of an array, and then we run it, it still works as intended, like that. So this is how you use recursiveness. So this idea of running a function within the same function within itself is called recursiveness. So you can use this to your advantage instead of having to repeat your code. So how do you know when to use it? When you're repeating your code in the same function like this, or whenever you're repeating using loops, you might consider using recursiveness instead. Our next tip is when dealing with HTML plus PHP combined. So I'm going to paste some code here. So HTML plus PHP. So imagine I have items in here and I want to loop through them like this. And then I'm going to do a for each loop like this. So these are items, and then I'll loop through each item and then echo out some HTML, right? So this is a standard practice that you'd normally do. So if I refresh, unexpected token on line 6, so I have errors. It's because I don't have a semicolon at the end there. Always make sure you have your semicolon there. So you see, it just loops through these posts as intended. Now the problem here you've seen, instead of me getting the actual item as the variable, what I'm getting is the text itself instead. Look at that. I'm getting item, 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 right? And that's because if I use single quotes on the outside, it doesn't evaluate any of these. So you can see the difference is that now if I put double quotes on the outside like this, it actually knows that this is a variable now. But the problem is I have double quotes on the styles here. So I have to change these to single quotes just so they don't clash with these other ones. And then once I do this, it actually works as intended. Look, it evaluates the product names there. So now the issue here is that I'm now using single quotes inside the style here, okay, which is not nice. Now, if you don't like doing that, you can still escape these values. I think this would work if I escape them like this. It could actually work. Let me go back here and refresh. It actually works like that. But this isn't very nice and clean. What we would do instead is just leave this as it is, and instead of looping with an echo, we actually just leave the HTML as it is like this, right? So what we would do is convert this whole thing into HTML. So I'm going to grab this part and move it to the top above the PHP tag, this one here. And then I will put just this inside my PHP tag and close it there. And then now I have a for each loop right here, which I want to loop through. So the reason why I'm doing this is I want to maintain my HTML as it is. Now this may not be a problem for a few lines of code like this for HTML, but imagine you have an entire HTML page that you have to design, and having to echo that is a nightmare. So instead, we want to leave the HTML as it is, but then deal with the PHP differently. So here on this one, we're going to put our PHP tag and then put the for each loop. Now, instead of using these brackets here, we're going to put a full colon and then close that. And then down here, we open another PHP tag and just say end for each, like so. Okay, so now what advantage you have is that it knows to loop between these two, but then you can put normal HTML code over here, right? This is just normal stuff, like so. So that is a better way of dealing with this stuff. So let's see how that looks over here. If I refresh, normal HTML code, there we go. And then we have that issue of this item here as well. Now, if you want to echo this item here, you put PHP like so, and then you say echo, and then here you close that like so. So this works fine. Let me refresh. You see there. But then if you're echoing a lot of things, this becomes too much. So what you do is you can replace the PHP and echo with an equal sign like so. That is a shortcut. Let me save that. It will do exactly the same thing, as you can see there. So this is the same as PHP and then echo. So all that is replaced by a single equal sign like that. Now with this for each and end for each, you can actually use this for while loops, for loops, and if statements. So you can simply replace, let's say, if this was if here, then it would be end if there. If it's for, it's going to be end for. If it's while, it's end while, and for each is end for each, as this one looks here. So this is one tip for, it's kind of like templating in PHP. So it helps you to make better HTML templates for your projects. Okay, and the next tip now is password encryption. So with password encryption, a good way to encrypt your password is to let PHP decide the algorithm to use. So what you have to do is in your users table, set a value to something like 255 as the size of the password column, right? It's password, it should be a variable character column 255 in length. Now the reason it should be this large is because you don't know what algorithm PHP will use, and so you just want to be safe. So in order to use the default password, let's imagine the password encryption. Let's imagine your password is equal to some password like this. So that's what the user enters in the form. So how you encrypt it, you say, let's call this one the hashed password, right? So the hashed password is going to be equal to password hash, like that. And then the string is the password that the user gave you. And then you leave this as password default. Now here you can put an algorithm if you want, a very specific one. But the advantage of leaving this one is that every time PHP is updated, this one right here will be replaced with whatever is the latest and best at that time. That way you don't have to think of upgrading, because if you actually specified a hashing algorithm here, then it means when things change and there's a vulnerability found with that hash, you will need to actually go in your code and change it to something new. But if you leave it like this, it will use whatever the default is at that time. So let me see if I echo the hashed password, what it will look like. So remember that we are typing the same exact password, which is some password, and let's see how the hash looks like. So I'm going to come back here and refresh. So look at this text over here, and if I now refresh, you see that it looks very different from the previous one. Look at that. It's a different hash every time. Now the reason it's like that is because PHP internally adds its own salt to the password. So a salt is just some text you add to throw people off that are trying to decode your password, for example. So even though two people type the same password, in this case it's some password, their hash will look very different. That's because the thing here adds an extra piece of text to your password for extra security. But then if it's this different, how exactly do you know that the password entered by the user was correct? So what you do, because this is a one-way hashing algorithm, so what that means is that once you hash your password like that, you can't unhash it again. It's a one-way thing. You create a hash for the password, you can't unhash it. So how exactly do you know if the password is correct that the user has entered, considering this is what you save in your table? Well, what you do is you hash the password that the user has given you again. And then once you hash it, then you compare the two hashes if they look the same. If they look the same, then that password is correct. But in this case, what we do, because we can't rehash, if we try to hash the same password again, we'll get different results. As you have seen here, every time we refresh, we get a different string. So it's going to be impossible to actually check using if the hash is equal to the new one. So instead, there is a function that was created to do exactly that. It's called password verify. So here you put your password, which is the password that the user has entered, and then the hash is the one you saved in your database, the hashed version. So you just say if password verify, and then here we will echo password correct, like that. Okay. So let me just put some break tags here just to make sure this is on a separate line, like that. Or else we can echo password incorrect, like this. Now it's going to be correct every time because we're using the same password that we hashed, and then we're using that same one to verify again. So if I now refresh like this, you see password correct, even though it's a different password, password correct. But if for some reason we try and edit password here before we are verifying it into something, let's just add a number there somewhere, and then let's try this, it will say password not correct. So this is how you can actually hash your password, save it in the database. So you save this in the database, and then when you're trying to verify if what the user has typed is true, is the correct password, you use password verify. This function returns true or false. So you can say if password verify this, it will return true or false, and then you choose what action to take next. All right, our next tip is on error handling. Now, usually when there's an error, for example, let's try and create an error here. I'm gonna say num is equal to something like that, and then I'm gonna say echo num divided by 3, like that. Let's see what error we're gonna get here. Okay, so there's a fatal error here. It says unsupported operand type on string. So it's telling me that I'm trying to divide a string divided by an integer, which it does not work. Okay, now the way the error looks here is it's not very neat. So if you want to actually handle this error in a very different way, or you want to type some very different text, you can by creating a function that handles your errors. So here you can create a function. Let's create a function here. Let's say we're just gonna call it error, like that. Function error, like that. That will be our error handler. So here I can, inside here, I'm just gonna echo an error occurred, like that. Okay, and then what do I do now? I have to set this function as a error handler. So I'm going to say set error handler, and then error handler will be this function name here, like that. Okay, so let's see what happens when we do this. So I'm gonna refresh. Oops, so that didn't work, except we actually set a error handler here. So the moment you say set error handler and you put your function name in there, this should actually take over whenever there's an error. But the issue is that what I was trying to show you is that there are errors that you cannot actually handle. So let's imagine for now we num is equal to something, right? And then let me just try to access num as an array offset. Now this would actually work on a string because a string is kind of an array in a sense. So I want to put a number that I know does not exist here, because if I put 0, it will show me the letter S, because these are individual array items in a string. That's how programming languages work. But in this case, I want to grab an element on the index 50, which I know, even though this is a string, it actually doesn't have that. So let's see what happens when I do that. So let's go to the page and see what's going on. So I'm going to refresh, and you see it shows me an error occurred. But that's because that's what I told the function to do. Now here, the problem is, it says an error occurred here, but I don't know what line number, what type of error. So here we can say error level. There are things that come with this function that we can put in there. So the error level, there's the error itself. Let me do this. Sorry. And then there's the error, I think this is like the line number, the file actually. and then the line number of the file. So there are like 4 items here. Now, if you don't know what item is which, it doesn't matter. Just put them in a list like this and do a test and see what information you get from each one, right? So for example, the error level here. Now, here we can just do an echo like that, and then put some break tags. Just put break tags on these things and say error level, and then here we'll put the error level there, and then the error itself. So I'm gonna do error, and then we're gonna put error itself there like so, and I want to put a break tag over here. Sorry about that. Okay, that way it just doesn't say an error occurred. File, what is the file name in here? So we're gonna swap these in case they are not correct, right? Line number, and then let's put line over here. So this is how you can handle the error itself. So you see here it's error level 2. Error itself is an initialized string offset 50, right? The file, this is the file where that happened, and the line number is 15. So like this, you can design very nice looking errors. If, for example, you're making a framework or something, then you can design your errors to look very specific. Okay, so now, like I said, this is an error handler and it will handle most of the errors, but there will be errors that cannot be handled. For example, if there's a syntax error, let's say I type some gibberish over here and save that. So if I try to run this, I'll not get a nice error. It's just going to say parse error. This is a syntax error. Now, the reason that doesn't do that is because this error is generated before we even run the thing. So before it even knows that your function exists, this error has already occurred. So this is why this function cannot be used in such an incident. Now, it doesn't matter whether we've put this at the top or at the bottom here, because this is indeed a syntax error which will happen before anything or functions are loaded. Because if there's a syntax error, it means it can't read your code very well, which means of course it won't know where your function is or if it exists at all, right? So you can use this sparingly. Also, you don't have to actually name your function like this. You can put an anonymous function in here. You see, instead of passing in the error name, you can just put a function like that in there, open, close, and do it like this. So you set your error handler, but your function is within there. That way you don't have to give it a name. It can be an anonymous function. And then let's grab these guys and put them in there like so. And we don't need this function part anymore. So let's go back and see. As you can see, there we are. We get the same result, right? Great. Now, there are times when you don't want to set a whole error handler like this. Maybe this is a bit much. So let's ignore the error handler for now. Actually, let me just mute this code over here. We may need it soon. But let's say you want to read a file, and so we're gonna do file get contents, right? We want to get contents from a file, and right now I don't have a file named filename.txt like that. And this one, I want to set this to a variable called data and say is equal to. And then now I want to echo data itself like that. So in this case, I'm going to get an error because this file does not exist. But let's see here. If I refresh, then I get warning, file get contents failed to open stream. Now, instead of echo here, I want to use var dump. That way it tells me even the data type of what I'm echoing, because sometimes we echo a false, it just looks empty or a no value. So you see here, it tells me this is a Boolean and it's false. That's what I get. Okay, great. Now, what if I know that there will be high possibilities of getting errors here and I don't really care if there's an error or not? I'll put code down here to handle a situation where there was an error. Because right now we've seen that even though there's an error, we get a Boolean in this value. So we can simply check for a false down here and know the file didn't run properly. This part didn't run properly. So there's a suppressor. This is the @ symbol. So if I put an @ symbol here on this line, it will suppress any errors that come from here. Okay. Now, of course, you may want to, let me see here. Let's see what happens. So if I refresh, you see that error is gone because it is suppressed by this guy right here. Now, the error itself did occur. So in the memory of PHP, it knows that there was an error. It's just that it decided not to show you because you said so using this @ symbol. Another way is to set the initialization variables. So you say ini set. So this sets a value in the php.ini file. So there's a param here called display errors. And you can set this one to a 0, like so. And once you do that, you switch off error reporting. So let's try this out again. If I refresh, you see no error occurred, even though I don't have the @ symbol here. If I put 1 here, then it means I want errors to show, and there is an error right there. So here you can use true or false still, because 1 and 0 represent the same value. Now, if we put the 0 here, and then let's move that to set the ini thingy after we've done this. Let's see if that makes a difference. So if I refresh, you see I still get the errors, even though I've said do not display errors. That's because this thing is set after we've already had an error. So the order matters. In this case, you have to put this right at the top of your page in order for it to mute the entire page. So this is how you can mute everything that comes after this point. Every line of code that comes after this point will not display errors if you put this there. Now, the part where we do this, right, where we suppress an error like that, what if you want to just handle the error in a nice way? Because you can't actually, let's see if this runs with our error handler at all. So let's try that, and let's move this. And as you can see, it actually works with our error handler, which is very nice. So we can change how we do things by setting that error handler there. And then this part, instead of just showing us a random error, it actually does it in an orderly fashion. Now, another way to do this is setting an error handler for your entire project, right? Now, what if you don't want to set this for an entire project, but you want something like this again? You don't want to suppress the error there, or you want to suppress it, but you still want to see it just for a couple of lines. This is where you put the try catch. So there's a try catch block like this. Here you say what you want to grab. So in this case, I want to grab an exception. So I'm going to write exception, give it a variable there to catch that exception with. Even though in PHP 8, you don't actually need to put that, it will still work. So let's move this over here. So we put this inside a try block like that, okay? And we try to read this and then catch the error. Now the error here, the E is an object. So we can echo this object, echo contents of this object. If you want, actually, you can do print R like this. Let's just see what's inside E if we grab anything. So this is a try catch block, very standard. Let's go back here and let me refresh. So you see, instead I get this, which is annoying, right? So let's see if I put the universal class, which is throwable, here. Let's see what happens here, because it says no such file, warning. It still doesn't work. Let's see if we put error here. Still doesn't work. Okay, so none of this works at all here. So what do we do? Well, I want to suppress the error instead. So here I will say suppress this error. And then let's go back and try that. So now we've suppressed the error, right? So how do we know whether there's an error here and if we want to check it still? Well, what we can do is use that question, those double question marks we had, or maybe the or sign actually. Throw a new error like that. And let's put an error like that. Actually, since we are grabbing an exception here, let's throw an exception instead. So I'm going to grab this here. Let's put our message in there. Could not read from file, like that. So let me save that. So if I come back here and refresh, exception object here could not read from file. Now, if you notice, this is the object we are getting because we told it to echo the object here. That's where we're getting that. So if you look here, there's a message, which is a private protected value, so we can't really grab it from there. This is actually an object that is being created, or a class. So instead, what we're going to do is let's echo. I thought we could see the method, but we can't see it. So there's a method here that says get message, because there are getters and setters in there. So get message is from the class that we've created, the exception class, and it will show us the message. So other things you can get as well. So you see, could not read from file. As well, you can get more information about the error, the line number, etc., etc. You can read about exceptions and the object that's created in the try catch and see how you can grab other things. Instead of just get the message itself, you can grab the object and get other things like the line number, the file name, and so on and so forth. Here, instead of using or, you can also use that double question mark we saw earlier. It will do exactly the same thing. Or does it? No, it doesn't actually, because this one returns a Boolean, which is false, and false is not really a no. So this would only work if this was returning a no value, but it doesn't. So let's use the or instead there, like so. Okay, so that's how you can handle errors. Now, if you don't want, let's say for example, this eGet message, you want instead, we want to use this function over here, or we want to echo things from there. So I'm going to grab this. Let's try out and say function. Let's do show error, right? Actually, I think I did create a function here. Let me grab this over there. I think this will help out, so I don't have to type all of this. So the show error function here will echo out a value from e. So we're gonna call a variable here called e that we'll put here on the show error, like so, and then that's what we'll echo in there. So I've created a function that echoes a table. This is just a table here, so you can go through it and see what code is written here. I'm just echoing some styles over here, and then the table itself here. Now the table just shows the message, the file, and the line number. Okay, so how do we get this information? Right here, as you can see, we got just a message, right? This message could not read from file, right? But we can actually do something like, let's run this function instead, the show error. And then what we can pass in, now in fact before I do all of this, let me just do a print readable so that you see what we can get from here. There's error get last, like that. That function grabs whatever error was created last. So if a new error is created, whatever you get in here is replaced by the newest error. So this one gets the latest error that's there. So let's just see what happens here. We're just telling it to print the last error. So if I refresh now, you see it gives you an array with a message in there, the type of error, the message itself, the file, and the line number. So this is where we're going to get that information from. So instead of doing this, we'll say show error, and then give it that error get last. That will be captured as E over here and then echoed out there. So let's see how that looks. If I refresh, you see this is a table. At least it gives you a nice looking error handler like this. So this is the error itself, the file name, and the line number. So this is how you can learn to catch errors and not be victim to the way errors look all the time in PHP. Now, please remember that there are errors you can't catch. For example, the syntax errors and stuff. If I do that, create a syntax error, I will not be able to catch that error. All right. And our final tip now is using types. Now, please keep in mind that this final tip only works in PHP 8 and above. So this is one of the new features in PHP 8. Now I'm going to do a separate video on new features in PHP 8 so that at least you can learn to take advantage of those. But here we're talking about data types. So I'm going to this is our bonus tip here, by the way. So what I'm going to do is grab this content here and I want to paste it over there. So now if we look at this, there is a function here that takes in an array. Okay, so the function is named getItem. So it just grabs one item and it expects an array here. So the array here I've created is B. So B is an array. This one is just some text. So this one is an array of 0, 1, 2. Okay, so it contains some array keys in there. And then there's an items array here, which contains 3 items corresponding to 0, 1, 2, of course, here. And then now all I want to do is echo the item inside items, but the key itself will come from the array. So the key here will come from the first item in the array there. Okay, now this is a very particular example, and the reason I've picked this example is because regardless whether we put an array or a string, this function will work just fine. Okay, so let me remove that text. Let me put it as this, like so. Okay, so regardless what I put here, I'm expecting an array. So let's see how this actually runs. So let's try and run this function right now. So I'm just going to call the function here by doing that. And then in there, I'm going to pass in the value B because that's what it expects, an array. So let's give it an array. So if I come back here and refresh, you see it says item is book, right? Great, book. But how did that happen? Well, the first item in the array here, inside this array we passed in, which is B, is 0. So this is exactly as saying items 0, like that. Okay, so we can put maybe items 1 like so, which is going to use 1 there and use that as the key over here. So that's going to work just fine. It will say table this time. Now watch what happens if I put A instead. So instead of supplying an array, I supply a string instead, right? Let's see what happens. Surely this will cause an error, right? But no, look at that. It actually works just fine. So why does it work? Now the reason it works is because a string is also an array inside almost all programming languages, because there's no such thing as a string. It's actually characters, individual characters, and then a string is just an array of individual characters. So which means this is very valid to do this on a string. I'm just telling it to get the second item in the string, which is 2 in this case. So that's why it shows person there, because that's 0, 1, 2, right? So now the problem here, this may not seem like a problem, it may seem like an advantage actually at some time, but it's a problem because this code runs just fine. Whether it has received an array or not, it just runs, and then it will be very difficult for you to find where the problem originated from. If, for example, this was supposed to be an array, but instead it's a string, further on in the code, it will cause problems because you are receiving the wrong data type. But the problem is finding the problem will be an issue. Where the problem started will be an issue because this function seems to run just fine, even though it's receiving the wrong data. So a way to fix this is to put data types on functions. So here, instead of just saying array you're expecting, you can tell it that here I'm actually expecting an array like so. Okay, so you tell it array like that, then it knows. So whenever you're putting items like this, you can put string or boolean for booleans, or int for integer. I think is it int or integer? I'm not sure. I think you can use both. You can use a float and so on. All the types. You can also use mixed type if you're not sure what the type is going to be. However, that's not a very good way to do things. But the bottom line here is that if I put error now and then I supply a string, it's actually going to stop the execution. Now, actually, let me see here. Before I explain that, let me refresh. And you see now it says the fatal error. Get item, argument 1 must be of type array. A string was given instead. So this is good because, for example, imagine this is a banking application, right? And somebody types in the wrong thing. So it could be that this function will run, this function that's running is supposed to save the book balance of somebody. So if it gets the wrong information and still saves that data, it may save a wrong number inside somebody's bank account. So that could be a huge problem right there. And you never know there was an error because it won't throw an error. It will just keep running because even string can still work, and then it will keep giving you the wrong information. So this is good because then you can stop the execution of the program and fix the error before you actually override important information. So in this case, you can see this is a fatal error, which means that it actually stopped the running of the program, which is good because then if there was something being saved, it won't be saved with the wrong data. So this is why you might want to do this. Now, there are times when you want to accommodate both arrays and strings and it doesn't matter. So what you can do is you can put a pipe and put string over there, for example. So in this case, it expects either an array or a string like so. At least this eliminates, if you receive a boolean, then you know there's a problem, right? So at least you can put something like this. Now you can put even 4 or 5 items like this, but at some point, if you start putting this many, you may just consider putting mixed value like so. Or you can just, by the way, void is also a type actually. So void is like no, it's emptiness, right? So that's a type as well. Now to add to this, you can actually put a return type for your functions just to make yourself strict with your coding, right? So here at the end of the function, this function doesn't actually return anything. So you can actually do this and say void at the end. So you put a full colon and say void like that. So this means it returns nothing. So like this, it's going to run just fine. And then if it returns something, then you know there's a problem. So for example, if at the end here, just say return 0 like that, then it will know there's something wrong here because this is supposed to return void. A void function must not return a value. So this will make your code more strict. So in this case, I would say int as the return type. So that way it knows there's an integer to be returned and then if for some reason I don't return anything, then it will cause an error like this. So it becomes a more stricter language if you do this kind of stuff, and this is good, keeps you on your toes to make sure that you don't make mistakes in your code. So if I return no, for example, here, that causes a problem. But if this is void, I think void and no are one and the same thing. So if I do that, no, actually a void function shouldn't return anything. Yeah, actually no is a type as well, so I can put no like that, and good. No cannot be used as a standalone type. Okay, yeah, wow, emptiness, really. Okay, so at least you get the idea. Now even here you can do the same thing as here. You can say I'm returning a string or a no, like that. So there it is, either a string or a no. That is fine, you can do this. Also, when you are, okay, let me do this. Another trick is that if, for example, you're expecting an array, you could be expecting maybe a string or an empty value here, okay? So what you could do, if you're expecting an empty value, you could put a question mark here. This makes it nullable. That means it's possible, it's okay to not pass in the value, because this will be set to null. So for example, if I don't pass in anything here, for a moment, let me just do return here so that we don't process any data. I just don't want to see any errors, then I know everything is fine. Must return a value. Okay, so it doesn't return anything. Wait, what is it saying? A function with return type must return a value. Did you mean return no instead of return? What is it talking about? Okay, let me remove this part here for a second so that it doesn't bother us with that. Okay, so there's an line 8, unexpected identifier. Oh, I accidentally put an L there. Okay, so let's refresh. An argument, too few arguments to the function get item. Okay, so here the items are not enough. This is not an optional one, so I'm going to put an empty array like this as an optional to make it optional like this, right? So without that question mark, this is fine like this, which means I can either put something or not, right? So now if I come back and refresh, parameter r of type string. Oh, okay, sorry, this one's this is very confusing. Okay, so this is good because now it's forcing me to type things in a good way, right? So array, I was using an array as a default value for a type string, so that doesn't work. So this has to be an array for me to put an array default value. So let's imagine I refresh like this and no errors, right? So everything is going well. There's an array here, but if imagine I supply a no value in here, an empty value like that, I do supply a value but it's empty. So this is expecting an array, and if there's nothing, it uses an empty array, but there's something there which is a no value. So I've supplied an empty no value there, and then it tells me, okay, you can't do this because it expects an array. Argument 1 must be an array, but a no was given. So what I could do is put array and then do this and say no, like that. Then it expects either of the two, right? Refresh. That's fine. But instead of doing that, you can also simply put a question mark at the beginning like so to say this is nullable. Even a no value is acceptable there as well. So as you can see, if I refresh, it still doesn't cause an error, but if I remove that, it will actually cause an error. Okay, so that's how you can nullify a value and say it can be an array or a no. It's the same with the return type. You can want to return maybe a string, but a nullable version, you can do that. and so return null is valid as well. So if I now come back to here, I don't expect, okay, a function with return type must return a value. So here it's getting confused, I guess. So maybe that is not a good idea here. Because it should allow a nullable string there. Anyway, if that becomes a problem, you can simply just do that. Same thing like so. Okay, great. Must return a value. Okay, so that's where the problem is, I guess. Let me return a string. So this doesn't work as well because it doesn't want to return a null for some reason. A function with return type must return a value. Okay, so I see what the problem is. It's because there's a return here, so it's blocking everything else. I forgot about that entirely for some reason. Okay, so let's get back to what we were saying. Instead of putting null like this, better you put a question mark at the beginning like that, which is the same. It means we can return a string or a null value. So here I'll just say return null like that, so we don't run the code. So I'm gonna do that and refresh, and everything seems fine. So I can either return that or return a string and it will work just fine. Okay, so this is how types work. Now, like I said, I'll do another video for new features in PHP 8, which are pretty cool, and how you can use them in your projects. All right, so I hope this was useful. At least you found one tip, at least, that is useful. I'll probably make another video with more tips, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.